This story is titled, My Parents Dumped Me in a Foster Home to Travel the World with Their Favorite Daughter, so I became the one they could never afford to face. Hi everyone. Before we dive in, a quick favor. If you enjoy content like this, please hit the subscribe button. It's free, supports the channel, and make sure you never miss out on amazing videos. All right, let's get started. Hey guys, I've been lurking here for a while and wasn't sure if I should post this, but honestly, it's been weighing on me for years. Maybe putting it out there will help me make sense of it all. My name's Alice and I'm 24 now. But this story starts years ago, when I was just 12. Back then, I thought my family was pretty normal. At least what I thought normal was. We weren't rich, but we had a decent house, decent clothes, and life seemed okay. My parents, Laura and Greg, didn't act like anything was wrong. Well, until it was. Then there was my sister, Emma. Emma was the golden child. You know the type. Teachers loved her. Parents couldn't stop bragging about her. If she so much as sneezed, it was treated like a masterpiece. Me, I was just Alice. It wasn't like I was a bad kid or anything, but no matter what I did, it was like I was background noise. Emma got the fridge space for her drawings. I got a pat on the back and a, "That's nice, Alice." And the thing is, I didn't hate Emma for it. It wasn't her fault they treated her like a trophy and me like I didn't matter, but it definitely made me feel like I wasn't important. Anyway, the day it all fell apart started pretty normally. I was in my room playing with some old dolls I wasn't quite ready to outgrow yet. Then Laura called me downstairs in that weird voice parents use when they're trying to sound calm, but you just know something's up. I figured maybe I'd left the milk out or forgot to do a chore. When I walked into the living room, though, Greg and Laura were both sitting on the couch, looking way too serious for it to be about milk. "Sit down, Alice," Greg said, motioning to the chair across from them. His tone was clipped, like this was a meeting and not a family conversation. Laura, on the other hand, was doing her best to look sympathetic, but something about it felt off. I sat down, baffled. Laura took a deep breath and said, "Alice, we need to talk about something important." My first thought was that someone had died. Maybe a grandparent I barely knew. But then Greg said, "We've hit some financial struggles and we can't afford to take care of you anymore." At first, I thought I misheard him. Like, "What do you mean can't afford to take care of me? Am I some kind of subscription you're canceling?" I just stared at them, trying to process what he'd said. But Laura kept going. "It's not your fault, sweetie. This is something we've been struggling with for a while, and we had to make a really hard decision." A hard decision, right? They made it sound like they were deciding which cable package to keep, not whether or not to abandon their kid. I asked what they meant, still hoping this wasn't what it sounded like. Laura explained that they'd found a foster home for me and that it was just temporary. She kept saying that word temporary, like it was supposed to make me feel better. "Why can't Emma go to the foster home?" I blurted out. I was desperate to understand. Laura's face turned cold for a split second before she said, "Emma's in school, Alice. She needs stability." Stability? Like I didn't. Greg cut in before I could say anything else. "This isn't about choosing one of you over the other. It's about what makes the most sense right now." I started crying, and not the quiet kind. It was ugly, full-on sobbing. Because how else does a 12-year-old react to being told her parents are giving up on her? Laura tried to hug me, but I pushed her away. "Why are you doing this?" I asked over and over, but all they did was repeat the same rehearsed lines about tough choices and financial struggles. The next day, they packed a small bag for me and drove me to the foster home. The ride there was quiet. Not the kind of quiet where people are deep in thought, but the kind where you can feel the tension in every breath. I kept staring at them, hoping one of them would crack, would look back at me and say, "This is a mistake. You're coming back home." But they didn't. When we got to the house, I stayed in the car for a moment, hoping they'd change their minds. Greg turned around and said, "Come on, Alice, let's get this over with." Like this was some chore he just wanted to check off his to-do list. I stepped out of the car, clutching the duffel bag they'd packed for me. The foster parents, Mr. and Mrs. Miller, were standing at the door. They looked friendly enough, but I barely noticed them. All I could focus on was the fact that my parents, were about to leave me there. Laura knelt down in front of me and said, "We love you, Alice. This isn't goodbye forever. Just give it some time, okay?" She kissed my forehead, but it didn't feel comforting. It felt like someone was stamping a return label on me. Greg shook my hand. Not a hug, a handshake, like I was some distant cousin he barely knew. And then they were gone. I stood on the porch, watching their car disappear down the street, my chest getting heavier with each second. I kept thinking, they'll come back. They have to come back. but they didn't. That night, I kept replaying the day in my head. What did I do wrong? Was I not good enough? Why Emma and not me? Those questions stuck with me for weeks. And the worst part was I didn't have any answers. All I had was their promise that this was temporary. And even though I wanted to believe it, deep down, I had this gnawing feeling that I'd never see them again. Looking back, I realized that was the moment everything changed. It wasn't just about them leaving, it was about the way they left, like I was some burden they were relieved to get rid of. But at 12, I didn't have the words to process that. All I knew was that my parents drove away and I was alone. Over the next few days, the Millers tried to make me feel at home. Mrs. Miller made pancakes for breakfast every morning. Mr. Miller would pop his head into my room every now and then with random trivia. Despite their efforts, I wasn't ready to trust them, or anyone really. My parents had promised me this was temporary, so I held on to that like it was my lifeline. I kept telling myself they'd call, they'd explain everything, and I'd be back home before I knew it. But days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into years, and not a single word from them. It wasn't until I started school again that the reality of my situation began to sink in. Kids at school noticed I was new and asked me all kinds of questions. Where are you from? Why'd you move here? I didn't have the energy to explain the truth, so I made up vague answers like, "Oh, my parents are working in another state for a while." Even saying those words felt bitter in my mouth. One afternoon after school, I was sitting in the Miller's living room, scrolling through my phone and avoiding homework. That's when I made the mistake of looking up my parents online. I didn't even know what I was searching for, maybe just some kind of sign that they were still thinking about me. What I found instead knocked the wind out of me. There they were, smiling on a beach, the ocean behind them, looking happier than I'd ever seen them. The caption under the photo read, "Finally living our dream life." My stomach churned as I scrolled through their posts. Picture after picture of tropical vacations, fancy dinners, and of course, Emma. She was in nearly every photo, usually front and center, with captions like, "Our amazing daughter." It was like I didn't exist. The more I scrolled, the angrier I got. They told me they couldn't afford to keep me, but here they were living like they were influencers. And Emma, she wasn't in foster care like me. She was still with them, smiling for the camera like everything was perfect. I felt like my head was spinning. They hadn't just abandoned me, they'd erased me. What hit me the hardest wasn't just the pictures, it was the travel blog. Yep, they had a whole blog where they detailed their journey to freedom. They wrote about how letting go of material possessions, aka me, had given them clarity. They wrote about how letting go of material possessions, aka me, had given them clarity. I scrolled down to the comments, but this time something stood out. There was a comment from an account with no profile picture. It read, "Must be nice running away and leaving everything behind. Hope it doesn't catch up to you." I frowned. The words felt sharp, like they were meant to cut through whatever shiny image Greg and Laura were trying to project. My mind raced. What did the commenter mean by leaving everything behind? Were they talking about me or something else entirely? I clicked on the comment, but the account was private and their profile picture was just a blank gray circle. I scrolled further down the page looking for more. In another photo, one of Laura holding a tropical drink, someone else had written, "Guess skipping town was worth it after all." My chest tightened as I stared at the words. Skipping town? Why would someone say that? I scrolled through more comments, but there was nothing else as pointed as those two. Most people were congratulating them, telling them how inspiring their lifestyle was. I wanted to scream at those people for not seeing through the facade. I couldn't let it go. Were those comments random trolls, or did they know something I didn't? It wasn't like Greg and Laura were strangers to lying. They had told me they couldn't afford to take care of me, but clearly that wasn't true. Was there more to it? The questions swirled in my head, and I couldn't stop thinking about them. But what could I do? I didn't have access to their past or their secrets. All I could do was stew over those cryptic words and wonder what else they were hiding. I closed my laptop, my hands shaking. It wasn't just about the lies they'd told me. It was about the fact that they didn't even feel guilty. They were out there living their best lives, and I was here trying to figure out how to exist without them. That night at dinner, the Millers noticed something was off. I wasn't exactly subtle about my mood. "You okay, Alice?" Mr. Miller asked, setting his fork down. "Yeah," I mumbled, not wanting to get into it. But Mrs. Miller wasn't the type to let things slide. "You don't have to tell us if you're not ready, but if something's bothering you, we're here," she said gently. I looked at them, these people who barely knew me, but somehow seemed to care more than my own parents ever did. And for some reason, I broke. I told them everything, the blog, the pictures, the captions. I expected them to tell me to stop looking or that it didn't matter, but they didn't. Mrs. Miller just listened, her eyes full of that quiet sympathy I was still getting used to. Mr. Miller, though, looked pissed. "You have every right to be angry," he said, leaning forward. "What they did to you, that's not on you, that's on them, and don't let anyone make you think otherwise." It wasn't a grand speech or anything, but it hit me. For the first time, someone was acknowledging that what had happened wasn't my fault. Over the next few weeks, I started adjusting more to life with the Millers. They weren't perfect, but they were steady. They asked me about my day, helped me with homework, and encouraged me to try new things. I even started opening up at school, joining a couple of clubs and making friends. But the anger I felt toward my parents didn't go away. If anything, it grew. But I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let their decision define me. So, I started joining clubs at school. Not because I suddenly wanted to be the most social kid on the planet, but because I needed to stay busy. I signed up for the debate team first. I figured I was already used to arguing. Thanks, Greg and Laura. So why not put that to use? Turns out I was pretty good at it. Then I got a part-time job. Mr. Miller had been hinting for weeks that I might enjoy some spending money, so I caved and applied to a local bookstore. It wasn't glamorous, but I loved being surrounded by books and people who actually wanted to talk about them. Plus, it gave me a small taste of independence. Every paycheck felt like a step toward building a future that was mine and mine alone. Somewhere along the way, I met Ryan. Ryan treated me like a normal kid, not a charity case. When I told him about my parents, he just nodded and said, "That's messed up. Want to play video games?" One afternoon, I came home from school to find the house unusually quiet. Normally, Mrs. Miller would be in the kitchen, humming along to some oldies playlist, while Mr. Miller tinkered with something in the garage, but this time I heard hushed voices coming from the dining room. I paused in the hallway, just out of sight, straining to hear. "Should we tell her?" That was Mrs. Miller's voice, low and uncertain. "She has a right to know," Mr. Miller replied. "If it's about her, we can't keep it a secret. It'll just upset her." "She's doing so well right now," she argued. "We should at least wait until we know more. This letter doesn't explain much. It could be nothing." I took a step closer. "A letter about me?" Before I could figure out how to ask without sounding like I was eavesdropping, Mr. Miller sighed. "Fine, we'll wait. But if they contact us again, we have to come clean." I heard footsteps heading toward the living room and quickly ducked into the kitchen, pretending I just walked in. Mrs. Miller smiled when she saw me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Later that night, when everyone was asleep, I crept into the dining room. I knew I shouldn't snoop, but I couldn't help myself. On the table was a stack of mail, and near the bottom, I spotted an envelope with my name on it. I hesitated before picking it up. The return address was from a law office. My stomach turned as I opened it, scanning the first few lines. "To whom it may concern, this is a notice regarding an unresolved debts associated with Gregory and Laura. As the listed guardians of Alice, we request any relevant documentation regarding the family's financial situation during—" I stopped reading, my hands shaking. Debts. Was this what Greg and Laura had been running from? Had they dumped me, not because they couldn't afford me, but because they couldn't face their own mistakes? I stuffed the letter back into the envelope and put it back on the stack, trying to look like I hadn't touched it. My mind was racing. I didn't know what to do with this information. But one thing was clear. Greg and Laura had been lying about more than just their financial struggles. By the time I turned 16, things were starting to click. I'd been working hard in school, balancing my job and extracurriculars, and it was paying off. My grades were solid, and my debate coach told me I had a real shot at getting a scholarship. That was the first time I let myself imagine a future that didn't involve my parents or their baggage. It felt good, liberating even. Then the scholarship became real. I still remember the day I got the letter. I'd applied on a whim, thinking there was no way I'd actually get it. But when I opened the envelope and saw the words "full ride," I couldn't believe it. I ran downstairs to show the Millers, who were practically glowing with pride. Mrs. Miller hugged me so tight, and Mr. Miller kept saying, "I knew it. I knew you could do it." That night, I decided to share the news on social media. I wasn't big on posting personal stuff, but this felt like a moment worth celebrating. I wrote something short and sweet about how hard work pays off and how grateful I was for the support I'd gotten. The comments started rolling in almost immediately. Friends from school, teachers, even random classmates I barely knew. But there was one comment that made my stomach drop. It was from Laura. "We're so proud of you, Alice. Let's reconnect soon." Proud of me, after everything. I stared at the comment for what felt like forever, my anger bubbling to the surface again. It wasn't just that they commented, it was how casual it was, like we were just distant relatives who'd lost touch, not parents who had completely abandoned their daughter. I didn't respond. What could I even say? Instead, I deleted the comment and blocked them both. That was the moment I realized I didn't need their approval or their guilt trips. The scholarship gave me a new sense of purpose. I threw myself even harder into my studies, determined to prove to myself, and maybe a little to them, that I could succeed without their help. Mr. Miller started giving me financial literacy lessons, which I actually found interesting. He showed me how to save, budget, and think about long-term goals. It wasn't glamorous, but it was practical, and it gave me a sense of control I'd never had before. With their encouragement, I also started tutoring younger students after school. It wasn't something I'd ever seen myself doing, but it turned out I had a knack for explaining things in a way that made sense. Plus, it felt good to help kids who were struggling, especially since I knew what it was like to feel left behind. One day during one of our tutoring sessions, Ryan asked me what my ultimate goal was. "Like, where do you see yourself in 5 years?" he said, leaning back in his chair, like it was the most casual question in the world. I thought about it for a second before answering. "I just want to be stable, like have my own place, my own life, and not feel like I'm relying on anyone else." "That's solid," he said with a grin, "but don't forget to have some fun along the way." Ryan's words stuck with me. I realized I'd been so focused on proving myself that I hadn't left much room for anything else. So I made a promise to myself to find a balance. I kept working hard, but I also started saying yes to things I'd usually avoid. Game nights with friends, spontaneous road trips, even just hanging out at the park on a lazy Sunday. It wasn't much, but it reminded me that life didn't have to be all grind and no joy. By the end of that year, I felt like a completely different person. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was thriving. The Millers had become my rock. Ryan was like a brother, and I finally felt like I was on a path that was entirely my own. My parents' absence still stung sometimes, but it didn't define me. If anything, it fueled me to keep moving forward. Then things took a different turn once my graduation day rolled in. It was supposed to be the culmination of everything I'd worked for. The day I was finally going to stand up, surrounded by the people who supported me, and say, "I made it." The weeks leading up to graduation were a blur. I barely had time to think. The Millers were buzzing with excitement, making plans for a small celebration at their house afterward. Even Ryan, who normally shrugged off anything sentimental, seemed genuinely hyped for me. I still remember the morning of graduation like it was yesterday. My mind kept racing with thoughts about everything it had taken to get here. From the moment my parents left me on the Millers' porch to all the nights I stayed up studying just to prove to myself I could do it, I thought about it all. Mrs. Miller had ironed my graduation gown the night before, leaving it hanging on my bedroom door with a little note that said, "So proud of you, Alice." I smiled when I saw it. It wasn't just the note, it was everything they'd done for me over the past 5 years. They weren't just foster parents anymore, they were my real family. The ceremony itself was exactly what you'd expect. When my name was called, I walked across the stage to grab my diploma, and for a brief moment, it felt like time stopped. The crowd was cheering, and I could hear the Millers and Ryan shouting my name like I was a rock star. It was everything I'd hoped for. But of course, nothing in my life ever stays perfect for long. After the ceremony, we gathered outside to take pictures. The Millers were beaming, and Ryan was making dumb jokes about how my diploma was probably written in crayon. Emma had even shown up, which was a surprise since she usually kept to herself. It felt like my world was exactly as it should be, until I saw them. Standing at the edge of the crowd were Greg and Laura. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I hadn't seen them in years, and I definitely hadn't invited them. But there they were, dressed like they'd just walked off a cruise ship, scanning the crowd like they were looking for something or someone. I tried to ignore them, hoping they'd leave once they realized I wasn't going to acknowledge them. But Greg caught my eye, and before I could turn away, he started walking toward me, dragging Laura along behind him. My chest tightened as they approached, their faces plastered with fake smiles. "Alice," Laura said, her voice way too chipper for someone who abandoned their kid. "You look so grown up." Greg clapped me on the shoulder like we were old friends catching up. We're so proud of you, daughter. This is such a big day for all of us. All of us. The audacity of that statement made me laugh. I stared at them, unsure if I should scream, cry, or walk away. The Millers and Ryan were standing a few feet away, clearly confused, but not wanting to intervene. "What are you doing here?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, even though my hands were shaking. "We came to celebrate with you," Greg said, as if this was the most normal thing in the world. "We've made mistakes, Alice, but we always wanted the best for you," Laura chimed in, her voice dripping with faux sincerity. "We've missed you so much. We thought this would be the perfect time to reconnect as a family." "You don't get to call yourselves my family," I said. "You abandoned me. You left me with strangers and didn't even bother to check if I was okay. And now you want to show up like none of that happened?" Laura's smile faltered, and Greg's face turned red. "That's not fair, Alice," Greg said, trying to keep his voice calm. "We did what we thought was best for everyone." "Best for everyone?" I shot back. "You mean best for you. Don't stand here and act like you did this for me. You were living your dream life while I was trying to figure out how to survive without you." By now, people were starting to notice. The Millers stepped closer, their faces a mix of concern and anger. Emma surprised me the most. She walked right up to Greg and Laura and said, "You don't get to ruin this for her. You've done enough." It was the first time I'd ever seen her stand up to them, and I couldn't have been prouder. Greg tried to argue, but Laura tugged on his arm, whispering something about causing a scene. They both looked at me one last time, their faces a mix of frustration and pity, before turning and walking away. The Millers were quick to jump in, wrapping me in a hug and reminding me that today was about my achievements, not their drama. Ryan handed me a tissue, muttering something about how I should charge them for emotional damages, which actually made me laugh. The rest of the day was a blur. We went back to the Millers' house where they decorated the backyard with streamers and balloons. And for a few hours, I let myself forget about Greg and Laura and just enjoyed being surrounded by the people who truly mattered. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat on the porch with Emma. She looked at me and said, "I'm sorry for everything. I didn't see it before, but you were right. They manipulated us while they only cared about themselves." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. We sat there in silence for a while. I felt like Emma and I were on the same page, and that was enough. That day wasn't just about graduation. It was about finally standing up for myself and cutting ties with the people who had tried to drag me down. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. But I knew my parents weren't done yet. Their sudden contact with me, the way they were insisting on coming back into my life after all these years, made me feel that there was something off, and I couldn't have been more right. A week after graduation, I got an email from Laura. At first, I thought it might be an apology, though deep down I knew better. It was long, filled with half-truths and excuses. She wrote about how hard things had been for them, how they'd made mistakes, but always had my best interest at heart. Then she hit me with, "We hope we can move past this and reconnect as a family. You're doing so well and we're proud of you. Maybe you could help us out during this tough time." Help them out. After everything they'd done, or more accurately, not done, they had the nerve to ask me for help. It was laughable in a way that wasn't funny at all. I didn't respond. I deleted the email and blocked their address, but the anger lingered like an unwelcome guest. Emma had been keeping tabs on them, more out of curiosity than anything else. She filled me in on their latest antics. They'd burned through their savings trying to maintain the image of their so-called dream life, and the travel blog had flopped, leaving them with nothing but debt and bad credit. They had sold off most of their belongings and were couch surfing with distant relatives who, according to Emma, were starting to lose patience with them. "They're a mess," Emma said one night during a call, "but they're still blaming you for everything. They think if you just forgive them, everything would magically fix itself." "Forgive them for what? Making me homeless at 12? I snapped, the bitterness coming through in my voice. Emma sighed. "I'm not saying they're right, Alice. I'm just telling you what they're saying." Their downfall wasn't something I celebrated, but I couldn't say I felt bad for them either. They made their choices, and now they were dealing with the consequences. Meanwhile, my life was moving forward. One afternoon, I got a notification on my phone that left me speechless. Greg and Laura had found me on LinkedIn. They'd left a comment on a post I'd made about my upcoming scholarship. "We're so proud of you, Alice. Let's catch up soon." It was almost identical to the comment they'd left on my graduation post. I didn't even know they knew how LinkedIn worked. I blocked them immediately, but it wasn't enough. They started messaging people in my network, coworkers, professors, even the Millers. The messages were all the same. a mix of guilt-tripping and outright lies about how I'd abandoned them. One of the messages reached my boss at the bookstore, who pulled me aside one day to ask what was going on. "Look, I don't want to pry," she said, "but someone claiming to be your parents sent us an email. It was weird." I was mortified. "I'm so sorry," I said quickly. "They're not really part of my life. I'll handle it." To her credit, my boss didn't press me for details. She just nodded and said, "Well, if they bother us again, let me know. We've got your back." Hearing that was a relief, but it also made me realize just how far Greg and Laura were willing to go. It wasn't enough for them to invade my personal life. They were trying to sabotage my professional one, too. Emma stepped in around this time, posting a public statement on her social media calling them out. She didn't hold back, detailing how they'd abandoned both of us and refused to take responsibility for their actions. "Alice and I have worked hard to rebuild our lives without their support," she wrote. "We don't owe them anything." Her post went viral, with hundreds of people commenting in support. While it was validating to see so many strangers siding with us, it also escalated the situation. Greg and Laura started lashing out, posting their own dramatic rants about how we were ungrateful and how they'd sacrificed so much for us. Their posts were full of half-truths and outright lies, but the more they talked, the more people saw through them. Then Emma called me, her voice unusually excited. "You remember that old storage unit they had? Turns out they stopped paying for it, and the landlord let me grab a few things before clearing it out." An hour later, she showed up at my place with a battered cardboard box. "You need to see this," she said, dropping it on the table. Inside, I found a folder stuffed with paperwork, unpaid bills, foreclosure notices, and letters from collections agencies. My stomach sank as I flipped through them. "They were living way beyond their means," Emma said bitterly. "Failed businesses, maxed out credit cards. Looks like they ran instead of facing it." Near the bottom of the stack, a letter from their lawyer caught my eye. It mentioned restructuring finances and reducing dependents to streamline expenses. My name was right there, listed like a liability. I slammed the folder shut, my hands shaking. "They didn't leave because they couldn't afford me," I said quietly. "They left because it was easier than cleaning up their mess." Emma stayed silent for a moment before saying, "I thought you deserved to know." "Thanks," I muttered. After she left, I stared at the folder, torn between burning it and keeping it as proof. In the end, I kept it. Not for them, but for me. By the time I started college, their reputation was in shambles. People were flagging their crowdfunding campaigns as fraudulent, and even the relatives they'd been staying with had kicked them out. According to Emma, they were living out of their car, still clinging to the idea that I owed them something. Meanwhile, I was thriving. College was everything I'd hoped it would be, and I was determined to make the most of my scholarship. I also started a small side hustle, teaching financial literacy workshops on campus. It wasn't anything fancy, but it felt good to give back, especially knowing how much the Millers had taught me about managing money. One day during my second semester, I got a call from Emma. "You're not going to believe this," she said, her tone equal parts frustration and disbelief. "They showed up at my apartment." "What?" I asked, my chest tightening. "They were crying, Alice, begging me to convince you to talk to them. They said they're desperate." I sighed, rubbing my temples. "What did you say?" "I told them to leave. I said if they showed up again, I'd call the police." I didn't know whether to feel angry or relieved. Part of me hated that they were still trying to drag Emma into their mess, but another part of me was proud of her for standing her ground. She'd come a long way from the quiet girl who used to avoid conflict at all costs. I didn't owe them my forgiveness, my money, or my time. What I owed to myself, to keep building the life I wanted, free from their influence. But of course, Greg and Laura weren't done with me. They weren't the kind of people to let go, especially not when they thought there was something in it for them. It started with the calls, random numbers popping up on my phone at all hours of the day. I usually ignored them, but one day I made the mistake of answering. It was my Aunt Karen, a relative I hadn't spoken to in years. She didn't waste any time. "Alice, what is wrong with you?" she snapped before I could even say hello. "Excuse me?" I said, caught completely off guard. "Your parents are struggling, living in their car, and you're just ignoring them like they don't exist. They're your family, Alice. You owe them at least a little kindness." I bit back the urge to laugh. Kindness? Did they show me kindness when they dropped me off at a foster home and never looked back? Did they show me kindness when they left me to fend for myself at 12? Karen huffed, clearly not expecting me to push back. "They were doing what they thought was best. People make mistakes, Alice. You're being heartless." I hung up. I wasn't about to waste my energy explaining myself to someone who clearly had no idea what I'd been through, or worse, didn't care. Over the next few weeks, similar calls trickled in from distant relatives, most of whom hadn't bothered to reach out to me in years. It was the same script every time. I was the ungrateful daughter, the selfish one who couldn't forgive her poor parents. What none of them seemed to understand was that Greg and Laura weren't just bad parents. They were toxic, manipulative, and entirely unwilling to take responsibility for their actions. Helping them would only drag me back into a mess I'd fought so hard to escape. When the calls didn't work, Greg and Laura took things to the next level. One day I got an email from a lawyer representing them. The subject line alone made my stomach turn. Notice of intent to pursue financial support. I opened it, skimming the legal jargon that basically boiled down to this. They were suing me for financial abandonment. According to the email, they believed I was obligated to support them now that I was successful. It was laughable. First of all, I wasn't some millionaire. Sure, I was doing well, but I was still in the early stages of my career. Second, I'd been in foster care. Legally, I owed them nothing. I forwarded the email to a lawyer the Millers had connected me with, who reassured me it was an empty threat. They don't have a case, she said. They're trying to scare you into giving them money. Don't engage. It was good advice, but it still left a bad taste in my mouth. The idea that they could twist the story, that they could make me out to be the bad guy after everything they'd done, felt like salt in the wound. But instead of stewing over it, I poured my energy into my work. By now, my financial literacy workshops had grown into something much bigger. What had started as a side hustle was now a full-fledged organization, helping young adults across the country learn how to manage their money and build their futures. I'd partnered with nonprofits, schools, and even some big-name companies. Every success felt like a step further from the girl I'd been when Greg and Laura left me behind. Recently, I got an email from a producer who had heard about my story through one of my nonprofit partners. They were working on a series about resilience and wanted to feature me. At first, I was hesitant. Did I really want to put my story out there for the world to see? But after talking it over with the Millers and Emma, I decided to go for it. If sharing my journey could help even one kid in foster care feel less alone, it would be worth it. The filming process was surreal. At one point, they asked if I wanted to include anything about Greg and Laura. I thought about it for a long time before deciding to mention them briefly, not to shame them, but to give context to my journey. They made their choices, I said during one of the interviews, and those choices shaped me in ways I never expected. But they don't define me. My life now, the family I've built, the work I do, that's what matters. But during one of the filming breaks, the producer pulled me aside, looking hesitant. "Hey, Alice," she started. "We found something during our research. It's about your parents. Are you okay hearing it?" I raised an eyebrow. At this point, I'm not sure anything could shock me, but go ahead. She took a deep breath before continuing. It turns out they were evicted after defaulting on several loans. There's also a history of unpaid bills, and this is where it gets messy. Potential fraud accusations. It looks like they skipped town to avoid legal trouble. I stared at her. Fraud accusations? The words felt heavy, sinking in slow motion. She nodded. It wasn't major, at least not on the surface, but there's a pattern. Failed business ventures, sketchy credit card activity, and attempts to secure loans they had no way of paying back. They left a lot of people hanging. The anger I thought I'd buried flared up again. So they weren't just selfish. They were actively screwing people over, and they ran when it caught up to them. The producer gave me a sympathetic look. It seems that way. I thought you should know in case it comes up later. I nodded, though my mind was spinning. Their lies had always felt personal, like they were just about me. But knowing they'd left a trail of destruction behind them made it even worse. Each and everything about them confirmed what I already knew, that they'd abandoned me because it was convenient, a way to cut their losses and start fresh. However, when the documentary premiered, the response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from people who had grown up in similar situations, thanking me for sharing my story. Some said it gave them hope, others said it made them feel seen. It was humbling in a way I wasn't prepared for. Greg and Laura, predictably, tried to use the documentary to their advantage. They went on social media posting long, dramatic rants about how I'd painted them as villains and how they were the real victims. It didn't work. If anything, it backfired. People who saw the documentary started calling them out, pointing out the holes in their stories and questioning their motives. Their attempts to regain sympathy only solidified their reputation as manipulative and selfish. Meanwhile, I bought my first home, a cozy place in a quiet neighborhood where I could finally feel like I belonged. I invited the Millers and Emma over for a housewarming dinner, and we spent the night laughing, eating too much, and reminiscing about how far we'd come. Emma had been thriving too. She'd graduated from college and was starting her own career, free from the shadow of Greg and Laura. Honestly, I don't regret the decisions I made. Cutting ties with Greg and Laura wasn't easy, but it was necessary. My success came from the Millers, Emma, and the family I built. Not blood, but the people who showed up. And that's all that matters. At the end of the day, family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up, who stays, and who helps you become the best version of yourself. And the family I chose, they were everything I could have ever hoped for. In the months after the documentary, life settled into something I never thought I'd have: peace. I'd wake up in my little house, sunlight spilling through the curtains, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. Emma and I spoke regularly. Sometimes it was about work, sometimes just about the silly things we'd missed during childhood, the things we never got to share because of Greg and Laura's favoritism. Now, we were building those memories on our own terms. The Millers still treated me like their daughter. Holidays, birthdays, even the mundane Tuesday dinners, those moments became the anchors in my life. They never tried to replace my parents, but in every way that mattered, they had. But even as I moved forward, Greg and Laura kept trying to claw their way back into my life. Emails from new accounts, phone calls from numbers I didn't recognize, even letters that showed up in my mailbox despite my moving. Every attempt was the same. Guilt trips, half apologies, twisted stories about how they'd sacrificed for me. They wanted forgiveness without accountability. They wanted money without admitting the truth. They wanted me back in their orbit, not because they loved me, but because they needed something from me. But the difference now was that I didn't flinch. I didn't owe them anything. Not my time, not my money, not my love. They had chosen to erase me, and the irony was that now I had become the one thing they couldn't erase. I was living proof of their failure, thriving without them, succeeding because of the very people they'd dismissed as temporary. I realized then what the title of my life story truly meant. They had dumped me in a foster home to travel the world with their favorite daughter, thinking they'd never have to look back. But they were wrong, because now I was the one they could never afford to face. Every achievement, every smile, every victory of mine was a mirror reflecting their betrayal. And the truth was, I didn't even need them to face me anymore. I had already won. I had built a life they couldn't touch, a life rooted in love, resilience, and chosen family. So when I think back to that scared 12-year-old girl clutching a duffel bag on the Miller's porch, I wish I could whisper to her, "It's going to hurt, but you'll be okay. One day you'll be stronger than you ever imagined. And when they try to come back, you'll finally know. Family isn't who abandons you. It's who stays." And I smile because she finally got her answer.